Hey, well, good afternoon, everybody. I think that we'll make a start now because I'm conscious of our time this afternoon. So I'm Aileen McLeod. I'm Senior Advisor on the Wellbeing Economy at the European Policy Centre, and I'm also Interim Director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Hub in Scotland. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today at today's hybrid event to launch the EPC's Wellbeing Economy Policy Lab, and I'll be moderating the event, which is kindly supported by the Open Society Foundations. Now, as this is a hybrid event, I'd like just to let you know that this meeting is being recorded. So we will hear firstly from our panelists, but I will then open the floor for discussion. And so for those of you who are in the room, and I can see that people are still arriving at the moment, and it's great to see as many of you here as possible. But for those of you who are in the room, if you can just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. And for those participating online, please write your question in the Q&A box in Zoom anytime, and I will try and bring them into the discussion here later on. And if you can keep your questions as succinct as possible, then also that's not only is that easier for me, but it also means that I can get more of your questions in as well. So this hybrid event is scheduled to last about 90 minutes to allow plenty of time for questions and discussion. Now, the European Policy Centre has been working on the Wellbeing Economy agenda through its Social Europe and Wellbeing programme for a number of years now. And today, myself and my EPC colleague, Laura Rayner, who's a Senior Policy Analyst in the Social Europe and Wellbeing programme and who is with us online, we are delighted to launch the EPC's Wellbeing Economy Policy Lab, which we hope will help to inform and support wellbeing economy policymaking at the European and international level. And as we approach the new mandates, post the European elections next spring, we hope that the Policy Lab's work will also help to shape the EU policy agenda for 2024 to 29, especially, if we want to move out of that cycle of permacrisis and build on the foundations of the European Green Deal, which we believe implementing a wellbeing economy policy approach will support. Now, at the moment, and there's a lot that is going on in the wellbeing economy policy space, and as well as that is in the civil society space as well. We're seeing, lots of interest among our policymakers, our experts, civil society organisations at the EU and international level, with many different initiatives that are happening within, for example, the Commission in terms of the amount of research that the Commission is supporting through the Horizon Europe programme, as well as the European Research Council. The European Parliament, some of you may know that back in May, of course, the Parliament hosted a major multi-stakeholder Beyond Growth conference that was co-organised by a cross-party group of MEPs. There are lots of initiatives that are happening, as we will hear this afternoon, from the OECD, as well as in the World Health Organization and the UN, who are all looking at how to apply transformational economic models that move beyond GDP and prioritise maximising the collective well-being of people and our planet. And there's also a lot of work that's going on at different levels, whether it's at the local or the city level or in our regional and national governments. For example, our group of wellbeing economy governments that comprise Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand, Wales, Finland, and indeed with Canada. And they are already embracing our wellbeing economic models. And of course, there's lots of, I think, evidence-based research that's underway, focused on developing beyond GDP frameworks and wellbeing indicators and looking at how to increase their usability and acceptability and bring them into more active policy making. So I think we're now at the point, where the policy space needs to see much more happening in the political space. And at the same time, the political space needs to be supported by a strongly connected civil society space. And that, I think, can help to encourage and nudge our politicians to make more headway in shifting towards wellbeing economy policymaking, to be bolder in their actions, and to actually, give this agenda the political leadership and direction that it so urgently needs at the EU level. So what is needed now, I think, is a more politically informed intervention that can help to show citizens that the wellbeing economy is the right agenda, that this is the right road to take, that this is an agenda that is fundamental to addressing people's needs and fears and protecting them against those constant economic, social and political threats. And that, these are the benefits and the opportunities that it can bring and the difference that it could make to their lives, their livelihoods and communities. And that, I think, should help to ensure that there is a much greater political and public buy-in for a wellbeing economy policy agenda. And as a former minister in the Scottish Government and a former MEP, I think, we in the European Policy Centre, we recognised there was a need to create, a safe space for politicians, for high-level decision makers and key stakeholders to be able to come together in the Policy Lab as a way in which to help move this agenda forward, to unpack the challenges and opportunities, and to draw on the wellbeing policy expertise by bringing in the examples of best practice from different levels of governance, including the wellbeing economy governments themselves, to co-create a practical wellbeing economy policy agenda that is politically feasible, that is relevant, and crucially, that it is achievable as well. And also, to be able to provide mutual learning and support in terms of policy collaboration and innovation for wellbeing, and to build that political support and consensus by also not only connecting into with their EU level discussions, but also importantly into our national level discussions and bringing the wellbeing economy agenda into the mainstream of political and public discourse and making that the orthodoxy. So the Policy Lab will also be part of 2 Horizon Europe projects from 2023 to 27, which will study how mindsets, indicators, innovations and policies could better work together to build a wellbeing economy, to provide improved knowledge on indicators beyond GDP, and to envisage alternative and more sustainable policy options and scenarios for a sustainable future. So if you're interested in finding out more about the work of the Wellbeing Economy Policy Lab as we move forward, then please do get in touch with either my colleague Laura Rayner or myself. So I'm very happy to be joined this afternoon by an excellent panel of speakers, and I'm looking forward to an interesting and timely discussion. So each of our speakers will talk for around 7 to 8 minutes, and then I will open up the floor for discussion. So we're very fortunate this afternoon to have 2 of our wellbeing economy governments with us in person today. So from Scotland, we have Gary Gillespie, who's our Chief Economic Advisor in the Scottish Government, and he will outline the why of a wellbeing economy, so why this agenda is so important in the Scottish Government and why the Scottish Government has taken the approach that it has. From Wales, I'm delighted that we have Andrew Charles, who is our Deputy Director for Sustainable Futures in the Welsh Government. I know he has a couple of slides to show, I think more about the how of future generations policy making and how Wales has been implementing its wellbeing economy approach through its 7 wellbeing goals and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that was adopted in 2015. And joining us online, I'm delighted that we have Romina Boarini, who is the Director of the OECD Centre on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity. And Romina will outline our international efforts to shift the debate with a focus on the OECD's work and how it is supporting OECD countries in the application of wellbeing approaches to measurement and policy. And we'll also say something about the OECD's new knowledge and exchange platform on wellbeing measurement and policy practice that was launched yesterday and which the EPC is keen to collaborate with and support. And finally, we have Lisa Hough-Stewart, who's the implementation lead at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is a leading collaboration of organisations, alliances, movements, and individuals that are working towards a wellbeing economy. And WEAll works with global movements as well as local hubs, such as the one in Scotland, and place-based initiatives to jointly promote the need for a wellbeing economy and to support learning on ways of getting there. And Lisa will set out what is happening through the Wellbeing Economy Alliance to push the wellbeing economy agenda at the EU level, to build the EU momentum around this agenda, what is needed to make the meaningful progress and to overcome some of the barriers to change. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Gary.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Hope you can hear me okay. So I've got the why of the wellbeing economy. So I'm going to try and stick to the why and not go into operating frameworks or solutions. So I think the easy response is the imperative has never been stronger just now, given the challenges we face across climate, the whole transition to net zero. If we look at nature, biodiversity loss, if we look at what's happening within advanced economies in terms of inequality, participation, inclusion, and if we look at how the types of outcomes the economy produces at the moment, then we can see the need for change across these areas. If you add in the recent experience of COVID and how that impacted how people live and work, and then the current crisis we're dealing with just now in terms of cost of living, all of this points to a need to look at how we operate as a system, and I think the wellbeing economy is central to that. But before I get into a little bit more about the why, it's probably worth saying something about what do we mean by the wellbeing economy, because there's often lots of different definitions and different discussions about that. For me, it's a combination of kind of economic, social, and environmental well-being. And when I talk about economic well-being, I mean sustainable, productive, inclusive businesses, producing opportunities for people within the economy. Social well-being, we're talking about societal groups, communities, social capital, people feeling empowered, inclusive within their communities. And obviously environmental well-being, addressing the issues of climate and nature respectively. So we think about it, there's different definitions. The most common one I see now used is an economy that works for people and planet, recognising that the economy and growth is a means to an end, and that end is obviously improving the well-being of people. In Scotland, we talk about fair, green and growing economy. So growth is part of that as well. But obviously the direction of growth rather than the rate is maybe more important in that regard. But I think the key thing for me is the economy is the central part of it. So the economy is really, really important. And whether you're talking about green growth, beyond GDP, as Aileen mentioned earlier, the work done by the Commission, donut economics, mission economy, they're all really about recognising that we need a more holistic and system approach to how we identify and deal with these challenges. So if I kind of flick to the wellbeing part, so why wellbeing? And what we found in Scotland and other countries found is if you ask people what matters to them, then it's about broader quality of life. It's about relationships, it's about communities, it's about trust, having friends, being part of a kind of broader civic society. So there's something about well-being that is much broader than what we think. Of course, looking at well-being is not a new thing. It's been about for a long time in different forms, and different governments have looked at that. In Scotland this year, we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith when he was born, 1723. And he was a moral philosopher, and is often recognised as the kind of modern father figure for economics. But in one of his works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he argued that governments should be viewed, the success of government should be viewed in direct proportion to the extent to which they improve the well-being or happiness of their citizens. So even way back then, there was a recognition that the economy was really important, but wouldn't necessarily provide the necessary outcomes that we were looking for in that regard. On a kind of more technical level, I think for government, a wellbeing economy approach provides an operating framework that can be used within government. It balances the short and the long term. You'll hear more about that from Andrew with the work in the Future Generations Act. and it challenges the kind of silo mentality within areas. We had a former Deputy First Minister that used to say there's no one area of government or one department on its own can address the challenges we currently face. So it's kind of forcing that join up, that interdisciplinary approach that's required to address the challenges that we face. And I think staying on the why, I think whatever perspective you look at this from, so even if you take a narrow growth perspective, so if your only objective is economic growth, you won't achieve that given the social and environmental challenges we face. So there's an imperative, even if you were only focused on growth, if you think about inequality, diminishes the productive capacity of your economy, doesn't allow people to participate fully, leads to less cohesive societies, less resilient economies, which aren't as resilient in terms of economic shocks. And that was, I mean, I'm quoting essentially work from the IMF from 10 or more years ago. You can even make a stronger case on the climate side, the cost of global warming, nature loss in terms of dealing with the extreme weather events we're seeing, costs of adaptation are all costs that could be addressed by kind of system change and more upfront investment. So just to kind of finish up, so the imperative is clear. I think we need a holistic approach that addresses well-being, kind of putting kind of people, planet and prosperity together. Otherwise, we're creating challenges, particularly for future generations, in terms of the system that we've got at the minute. So there's a strong equity argument as well in that court. But my final points I'd like to say is that the economy part of it is really important to me. We could just be talking about well-being or well-being governments, but the well-being economy part is really important because how the economy interacts with well-being is absolutely crucial. Provides opportunities, provides incomes, provides many of the solutions, many of the services and goods that we use every day, and that can be a force of good really in harnessing this transition. So one of the pieces of work we're doing in Scotland is working with the business community around what the wellbeing economy means for them. So I'll finish with one last quote from Adam Smith, who also said in his Wealth of Nations that the business of business is business. And that was very much about let business get on with doing business. But he also recognised the need for regulation, the need to kind of the incentives of business weren't wholly aligned with broader outcomes. And really what we're talking about with wellbeing economies, harnessing that energy from the business and wider stakeholders to deliver a wellbeing economy. So irrespective of how you describe it, think about it as something that is about system change, it's about additive, it's about join up, and that's why we need it at this time.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that very insightful, I think, contribution around just, how, the Scottish Government has been, sort of trying to kind of take forward, a more sort of holistic wellbeing economic approach to its policy making. And I think there were a number of kind of key points that you made round about, the economy being, sort of a central part of that, and, and recognising the need for a more, sort of holistic system approach to deal with the challenges that we're facing. But also, I think that kind of crucial point was saying that kind of narrow focus on the kind of economic growth at all costs without having the kind of the social and the environmental dimension, that won't actually help us, to address, the very real and serious challenges that we're facing right now, and also the need to ensure that we are, looking to the longer term and, the impacts on this for our future generations, which sort of hands me nicely over to Andrew Charles.
Thank you, Aileen. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Andrew Charles, Deputy Director of Welsh Government. So the task I've been asked today is to give you, answer the question around the what. What does putting a wellbeing economy approach look like in practice? And I'm going to give you the example of Wales and what we've been doing in Welsh Government over the last 8 to 10 years to put in place a framework for a wellbeing approach within government. And that starts, it doesn't start with our Future Generations Act in 2015, but it's actually part of an ongoing journey that many governments have around their understanding of their role in charting and shaping the future of their nation in towards a wellbeing approach. So I've put some slides together. They will be available after, but it shows you a bit of the history of where we got to when we passed the law in 2015. I'll explain what that model looks like, but it's a model that tries to implement a wellbeing approach to government across the whole of a small nation. But this concept of wellbeing was part of our devolution journey in Wales back right from 1998, when we had a duty to promote sustainable development. And as Gary said, there are many different concepts being used in this field, where it's donut economics and sustainable development, and they're all trying to do the same thing, but using different concepts to make a difference. But we had a duty in 2006 to promote social, economic, and environmental well-being. But as we went through those early years of devolution, what we found is that the way in which we were developing policies, we needed a bit more of a step change. So there are many wellbeing approaches across the world. What we have done is use the lever of legislation. It was quite a relatively new thing for us in those early days. And so the role of legislation to drive, as a lever to drive forward a wellbeing economy approach, is one of many levers that nations can use and countries can use. We decided to use that lever because the evidence that we had showed that even though we had, quite high aspirations for promoting sustainable development, and that interaction between the economy, environment, and society, we realized we needed legislation to put some of the foundations of a wellbeing approach into practice. And so what I've got on the screen is a one-pager version of our framework. And I always say it's our framework because the frameworks that nations and countries use needs to be reflective of their particular circumstance, their particular economic, social, environmental context, but also how you bring ownership around that wellbeing framework. So our framework, was developed at the same time as the Sustainable Development Goals, which were passed and approved in 2015, in the same year that we passed our 7 wellbeing goals. So what we did is we had a conversation with the people of Wales about the Wales they want to see, and that we turned that concept around the future of Wales into a series of 7 wellbeing goals, and they are listed on the top of the architecture, but also defined in the legislation. Again, quite a different approach to prescribing the outcomes that we are seeking. And many of these outcomes are tailored to Wales, but many of those outcomes are the things that you will find in much of the literature around well-being, around prosperity, around healthy communities, around cohesive communities, around inequalities. So we have those well-being goals because it was important in many ways to define well-being for us, because we had lots of debates and we spent a lot of time with stakeholders around definitions, that we decided the best way to give a sense of what a well-being economy looks like was to describe them through a set of positive well-being goals. And they are translated in many ways from the SDGs. But what we have in Wales is ownership of the well-being goals because they went through the Welsh Parliament. But you'll also see a lot of the wellbeing frameworks out there have a whole range of different features, such as metrics. So we have, under our framework, the need to set national indicators. We set national milestones, and we have a regular exercise where every 5 years the Welsh Government is required to produce a future trends report, a regular cycle of collecting data and evidence around potential trends that are going to affect the well-being of our citizens now and in the future. And these mechanisms, again, are legal requirements on us as government to put in place and put out there as part of the good evidence for decision making. We also have legal requirements on us and public bodies to make a contribution to these wellbeing goals, because we realized, just having the agreement of what you're trying to achieve is not good enough. You need incentives and legal mechanisms to enable public bodies to make their contribution. And it goes back to what Gary said earlier, that this was a recognition that Welsh government or governments alone can't make all these changes. They require many different partners, both in the public, third, civil society, and the business sector. Our act only extends to the public sector, but our legislation is incentivizing different sectors. But we also realised that when we start talking about well-being in that wider sense, we needed to describe what that looks like in practical terms. What does it mean to put it into practice? So what we found from a lot of the literature was that many of the weaknesses of good governance, whatever issue you're dealing with, whether it's climate change, inequality, or the economy, there are these 5 sort of weaknesses that we needed to address. And they were the ways in which government and public bodies and institutions would make decisions. And they are listed on the screen. So they were the recognition that, as I said, we require many different bodies to contribute towards a wellbeing approach. So that's why we have in the law the requirement for us and public bodies to collaborate to achieve those goals. We have the integration way of working. Again, that's a recognition that, again, as Gary said, that we need to how we break out of those silos. So that's a recognition that we need to think about the economy and social environment. And in Wales, we added culture. We added culture to the wellbeing domain for what we meant in Wales. The other one is around involvement, the involvement of citizens that are affected by decisions. And the last 2 are possibly the more challenging ones. We made it a legal requirement for government and public bodies to think about the long term when we are putting in place policies. And that's where we have the Future Trends report to help us think about the future. The last one is prevention, because a lot of the challenges that we face that are driving us away from a wellbeing approach are a result of decisions made many years ago, either with or without the evidence. And so how do we shift the balance between making decisions that are reactive to try to prevent some of these problems? It's not easy. It's very difficult. It's not a switch that you go from reaction to prevention, but it's trying to make sure that that thinking is in place as we develop policies. But the other parts of our framework for a wellbeing approach also sets up an independent Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. We're now on to our 2nd commissioner, and that's an independent institution to support, enable, encourage, and sometimes hold us to account and criticise public bodies and us about the progress that we're making. But it was in recognition that we needed to give the future a voice in decision making, and that role helps public bodies to have that voice. We also have the role of the Auditor General. So there's a role for audit in looking at these decisions. So there's a range of frameworks that we put in place that puts our framework. And as I said, there are many different frameworks out there. We, of course, think ours is the one that's fit for Wales, but we, through the Wellbeing Economy Policy Labs and the other networks we make, we understand how different approaches are being taken by Scotland and New Zealand that help us understand how to implement our policy better. I'll just show a little diagram. It's not a perfect diagram, but it's an illustration of how we've tried to define well-being through our legislation. And it's the recognition that we have sort of environmental well-being, the environment that gives us the clean air that we breathe, the resources that we need to drive the economy that gives us jobs, that gives us decent work, the link between that then on social well-being. And as I said, what we did, which was quite a strong push from the Parliament at that time to add in culture, because it was recognised that culture was quite a strong emotion and a strong message coming back from Welsh parliamentarians as well as the Welsh civil society, that we needed to recognise the culture of Wales, our historical landscapes, our language, the way in which we interact. That was a really important part, which again goes back to, this is a seamless transition, but goes back to what Gary was saying around what people value in their lives and their connections to their place, their connections to their communities. And all of that is around understanding that all of these different well-being domains directly affect your well-being, my well-being. And even this poses a really difficult challenge for policymakers, because we're trying to provide a more holistic approach to decision-making. But we made it a little bit harder because we also introduced the concept of intergenerational well-being. So both we're trying to make sure that we develop policies that understand the connections between the environment, the economy, the society and culture, and your and individual's well-being, as well as then the well-being of future generations. And it's an important myth to bust around this agenda, that our act is primarily focused on making decisions for now, for the people now, but with a mind to what that means for future generations. Again, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not a switch that we can do, but what we've got in Wales is a framework that gives the future a chance in decision making and gives future generations a voice. It doesn't remove the hard decisions that politicians and decision makers have to make. It doesn't tell you what the answers are, but it provides a framework and a system to understand what that means in practice. That's a very quick overview. I'll leave the goals on the screen. I can send links later about our wellbeing indicators. We've got 50 of those indicators. We've got 17 milestones, but it gives you a sense of what we're doing. But the last thing I want to stress is a lot of work that we've been doing on the implementation of the Act is also recognition that decision makers, the people who are making decisions in government, in institutions, in other bodies, how do we develop their skills and their capabilities and their knowledge and their ways of working so that we can implement these policies? Because for many countries, we've got very good policies, but the implementation gap is always that challenge. So how do you address and equip the state, the civil society to implement policies that drive us towards a wellbeing approach? So hopefully that gives you one example of a model that countries and nations can put into place. We're 7 years in. We're about to start an evaluation of the legislation to see how it's worked. We've seen some examples of how it's been informing policy decisions, but it provides a really important context to discussion and discourse in Wales and with the Welsh Parliament. Thank you, Aileen.
Thanks very much for that very insightful contribution, Andrew, just setting out how Wales has been implementing the wellbeing economy approach in practice. And I think there are a lot of really kind of interesting innovations there that you kind of introduced. And, I guess it goes also, how you've kind of used, the lever of legislation, I think, to drive forward the wellbeing economy approach. And I guess to kind of put it on a statutory footing, as well as the way, having the role of the, a Future Generations Commissioner as well. And I think there was a very, important point that you made at the very end about, well, it was all important points that you made, but the one, talking about, the implementation gap and how do you actually, equip, not only with our decision makers, but also the kind of broader civil society, as well as obviously with our public bodies and with our businesses, because, we need everybody on board with this agenda. And as I say, and I think, there's a lot of, we don't really know how to do this. So there are a lot of learnings there for us all, and being able to have that, the opportunity to be able to kind of share, those kind of learnings. And as I say, to be able to kind of think about, okay, well, what are the skills? How do we build that capacity across different sectors to enable them to be able to kind of help to drive that system change forward, but doing it together as a cohesive one. So thank you very much for that. So I will turn now to Romina, and for her to kind of give us some of her insights into the international efforts around trying to shift some of these discussions and debate around the wellbeing economy through the OECD's work.
Thank you, and good afternoon from Paris. I'm really happy to be with you today. So what I'm going to do is that I will try to provide you a quick overview of the landscape on wellbeing initiatives in OECD countries. Next slide, please. And indeed, I will tell you a bit more about the current efforts in the OECD, and in particular in the center that I have the pleasure to lead, to ensure that those initiatives can get catalyzed and obviously the momentum is accelerated. So since we started doing work in the OECD on well-being, there's been a really very positive development across the OECD area. We see now that more than 2/3 of OECD countries have developed their own national frameworks, and those frameworks, come with a lot of diversity. Many of them have a focus on measuring and monitoring. Some of them, however, are also entering the policy territory with quite interesting insights and results. As you can see in this slide that shows you the timeline of that development, is really over the last few years that we've seen sort of almost an explosion of those initiatives. So, the pace, started increasing, and obviously that is quite positive. And this chart only shows, what we consider experiences at country level. So we're not putting there the very many initiatives that were done, at sub-national level, at local level, and by civil society. And I think, as Aileen, you were saying in your opening introduction, the civil society obviously has been very active, and luckily so. But so this is just to say that this is the picture, what national governments are doing. I also have to say that, of course, there are differences in the way countries approach the issue, but there are also some quite positive common points that emerge. And for an international organization like the OECD, I would say that convergence is really important, because part of the reasons we are doing this is actually to also ensure that countries are engaging in multilateral discussion on those issues. Of course, the national and domestic efforts are really important for shaping and driving their national policies. But what we're trying to push here is also an agenda where countries take, again, multilateral action. And that is what is needed to happen, actually, to make sure that we really transform the way the economy works. Next slide, please. So some of the previous speakers, both Gary and Andrew actually explained, the why. I mean, why is so beneficial? Why, what is the sort of promise behind embracing a well-being perspective or adopting well-being frameworks? And so obviously this is quite a sort of a important starting point for the OECD. So we always sort of recall the case, especially for countries that are new in this space. And so, in fact, there is some interesting evidence that is emerging that, in fact, suggests that there are really, really a number of interesting results that come from the application of the well-being thinking and the application of the frameworks. So there have been studies actually that have demonstrated that those well-being frameworks do lead to better outcomes. They do actually improve really the decision-making process, both from, in transparency, but also ownership perspective. They come with a strong focus in terms of long-term perspective. And so obviously they help addressing, some of the challenges where obviously you need to be very long-term consistent because the solutions require a major change that needs to be sustained over time. Many, I think, in fact, of the speakers talk a lot around, the importance of joint up policies and, creating alignment across the different sort of parts of the government. Here I'm talking about horizontal alignment, but actually it is also true that you have to think about all the different parts of the governments, especially when you have, big federal countries. And so it's also about connecting, the different levels of government, national and sub-national level. So a number of reasons why we think that, embarking in a well-being journey is really something that can bring a lot of good returns for citizens and countries as a whole. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a sense of the ways countries have actually developed this agenda. So I just provided you in the previous slide sort of the numbers and to again sort of suggest the momentum here. But actually, we are trying now in the OECD sort of to assess those different experiences. Try to sort of really appreciate not only what has motivated those experiences, but also what are the sort of various features. And we're doing that obviously with the idea of trying to sort of making sure that the experiences can be not only evaluated, but obviously can be exchanged, and there is a lot of knowledge and transferability of experiences from one country to another. And so, in fact, we have sort of categorized and organized, let's say, those experiences around sort of 4 areas. So these are essentially the 4 types of approaches that we see emerging in this space as being sort of the most sort of regular and recurrent. There have been various countries that actually have found ways to link well-being evidence to budgetary processes. So they have actually articulated in various ways the different budget processes and budget decisions with respect to the evidence that was that emerged from well-being metrics and indicators. So you have some example here that I'm not going to cover in detail, but maybe people will have questions and then we can sort of come back on this point. There are a number of other countries that actually have used the Wellbeing evidence to design performance frameworks and strategic coordination plans. And of course, we have all the examples of Wales and Scotland here. So really, these are the countries in a way that I think it was Gary was talking about the operating framework. So they used the Wellbeing approach as a way, really to design the operating framework to sort of prioritize their strategic goals and sort of try to address them in a very integrating and synergistic manner. There have been other countries that have instead extracted value from wellbeing approaches by trying to understand how policy appraisal and evaluation tools can actually be developed and put in place using the wellbeing perspective. And so New Zealand, for instance, have done various pieces of work, but the UK government as well has published a green book where they were looking at the essentially cost-benefit analysis from a wellbeing perspective. The Italian Treasury has also developed some very specific modeling capacity, again, to sort of try to understand how the budget decisions can have an influence on improving people's well-being. And finally, we sort of regrouped other approaches under the umbrella of embedding mechanisms. And so this is a sort of a kind of mixed bag that brings together sort of various experiences here. But we are, for instance, looking here at things such as the legislation. Again, the example of Wales, of course, is quite important, but also more generally speaking, the type of capacity building and how you sort of essentially not only equip people, but really sort of build up resources, including for making sure that the departments can work together on this important agenda. So a lot of different experiences here. Next slide. Even within the first group, so within the group of countries that actually are using wellbeing information to shape the budget processes, there is quite a lot of variation. And I think without going into the details again of those different experiences, what I just wanted a couple of points to observe, on this slide. First of all, is that in fact, this is only growing. So the number of the group of countries that are looking at this quite seriously, and then with either well-being tagging or well-being targeting approaches, or well-being, budget modeling. This is really increasing at pace. And in that respect, I want to mention, in fact, the fact that the G7 finance track of this year, under the Japanese presidency, took a special interest in looking at those experiences, obviously because the constituency is, composed of Ministry of Finance and Central Bank, so they really have a strong interest in understanding how you link well-being and budget. And so this is something that we are following very closely, and we supported the work of the G7 this year. We will support it as well next year. And so this is a way to say that this is really sort of changing the conversation, or starting to change the conversation in those very specific circles. Next slide, please. Now, what we're trying to do at the OECD is obviously be a catalyst for this, big change and this big movement. And this is why, in fact, just yesterday, as you were saying, Aileen, we launched our new knowledge exchange platform, Wellbeing Metrics and Policy Practice, which is essentially a hub, is a space, a stable space for OECD countries to come together, peer learn, amplify what they're doing on well-being, and also, of course, sharing on the various achievements and challenges that they're facing. We are organizing this platform, around three broad pillars. One that looks at measurement, the other one is looking at policy tools and implementation, so how you integrate in various ways the wellbeing evidence into policy. And the third is about putting a wellbeing perspective on policy issues, and in particular the emerging ones. Next slide is going to be my last for now, and this is where I'm just sharing details about what this knowledge exchange platform is going to do. And I obviously want to say that the way and the spirit in which we are working and building this platform must be understood to be synergistic with what the EPC Policy Lab wants to do. So we really hope that we will be able to, establish a partnership with you going forward. But just in terms of giving you an idea of what we do with this platform. First of all, this is an online portal that that essentially is collecting and curating evidence from those initiatives at various level, so national, international, and so you will find a lot of information there, but also actually what the OECD is doing in this space, because there is quite a lot that we are doing in the OECD. We have been doing now for 15 years. We will also start a series of structured knowledge exchanges activities, so a number of workshops, and with the time we will also establish an informal peer network where again the countries and governments can come together and share their experiences on the wellbeing agenda. And finally, we will hope to develop as well some more technical work that is also needed, because very often some of the questions that we get from our countries is really around sort of the know-how of those things, and so really they need to be assisted or supported, I think, in understanding how to approach the issues in many different ways. So I will leave it here, and thanks again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Romina, and that was absolutely super. I think really setting out for us, I think just the breadth and range of the international efforts, and I think it's great to see how much sort of international interest there is around this agenda. And I think I sort of took away that the statistic that there's more than like 70% of OECD countries that are, sort of trying to develop and implement wellbeing economy policy frameworks. So it's really interesting and super to see the progress that is being made. And also, as I say, my congratulations again on the launch of the knowledge exchange platform yesterday as well, because I think that really will be a very I think useful mechanism, as you said, Romina. I think creating that kind of stable space for OECD countries to come together and to be able to amplify what they're doing. So now that we've heard more about what's happening at the international level, I'm going to turn now to Lisa to sort of set out what the Wellbeing Economy Alliance has been doing to try and build momentum for this agenda at the EU level. Lisa.
Thanks, Aileen. And for a Brussels event, this is probably a record number of Scottish accents on a panel, I think. So hello from Scotland. And I'm part of the Global Wellbeing Economy Alliance team. As Aileen mentioned, we've got a number of national level hubs as well. And part of my role is leading on collaboration with others in civil society in Europe and advocacy work for a wellbeing economy in Europe. So civil society has been mentioned by every other speaker so far. So I'm here to bring a bit of the voice of civil society to this conversation and share a bit of an update on some of what's happening at EU level in civil society. So one group that we're part of as WEAll is a growing Wellbeing Economy Coalition, which is convened by the Zoe Institute and IEEP, European Policy Centre's part of that coalition as well. And earlier this year, that coalition created a shared vision for a wellbeing economy for the EU. It's one that's radical and progressive, and Gary shared a couple of definitions of wellbeing economy earlier, so I'll share the definition of wellbeing economy that civil society coalition has come up with. We say that the wellbeing economy we want is focused on meeting the fundamental needs and rights of all, providing a safe and just space in which everyone can thrive within planetary boundaries. We define it as an economic system that is no longer structurally dependent on economic growth. So still a mixed economy system with strong state, private and third sector actors, but one that's designed with a very different set of goals, values and incentives. And for WEAll, for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we put a lot of emphasis, as the other speakers have, on prevention, that a wellbeing economy is always preventative by design, stopping harm from occurring in the first place. And it's really encouraging how far the conversation already today has gone beyond indicators already. It's really important to talk about indicators, but I think we all know on this panel that they're not enough, that we need to move beyond monitoring and inform structural change. And that's what our civil society coalition and work with partners is really trying to emphasise at EU level as well, really trying to drive the conversation within the EU beyond indicators into practice and implementation. So the Beyond Growth conference that happened in May this year has already been mentioned as well. A huge event that we were one of many civil society organising partners on. 2,000 people taking over the hemicycle at European Parliament, and many more people joining online for the Beyond Growth conference. And much has been said already about the energy and the momentum that was felt in the room. And I'll just echo that, having been there, that it was probably the most people who are working on a wellbeing economy or a Beyond Growth agenda that I'd ever been in one place at one time with. And it was really quite powerful to feel the shared energy, the shared anger sometimes when it was felt that institutional speakers were not going far enough or were defending the status quo too much on stage, which happened a few times. But huge amounts of compelling evidence were brought to that conference from academics, from lived experience, from activists. And there was a certain degree of diversity that should be celebrated, although I would also say that it could probably have gone further and been more diverse. And one of the things that we are trying to emphasise with other civil society partners is the need to go beyond Eurocentrism at a European level as well, and to be truly international and explicitly decolonial in how we're imagining our future economies, and not repeat the same patterns of the past that sort of entrenched power structures. And that conference was just in May, so only a few months ago, but an enormous amount has happened since then. It feels like there's a big snowball that grew visibly larger in May and is continuing to snowball in terms of the civil society momentum in Europe around the Beyond Growth agenda or wellbeing economy agenda. Aileen mentioned the Two Horizon projects focused on this, which have now been funded at European level. So that will see a lot more work kicking off very soon. There's also a number of national initiatives and events that have been directly inspired by the Beyond Growth conference. So that I know of so far, there's Beyond Growth conferences happening at national level or in the works in Sweden, Denmark, Ireland, Austria and Italy. And we're sure to see more. I feel like I'm hearing about a new one every week, and many of our WEAll hubs are getting involved with those. Most of those are planned to happen in 2024. So that's a real impact of seeing national level policymakers, but also civil society on the ground within countries picking up the mantle of this agenda and making it relevant for them. We've also, as WEAll, with some key partners, Friends of the Earth Europe, EEB and the European Youth Forum, we've been convening civil society actors to try and bring us together more and really sort of supercharge the collaboration between diverse sets of actors, NGOs, think tanks, trade unions, activists. We had a civil society gathering in May just before the big conference, and we just last month got another group of civil society leaders together in Paris so that we could come up with some shared strategic objectives for what EU advocacy we could do and what should be the priorities for the new European Commission, the new European Parliament next year as well. So this knitting together and networking is really happening at pace in Europe, and certainly it's not just WEAll doing that, but we hope that we're providing some value there, and we see that as a key role for us to try and do some of that dot joining. And just this week, there was a workshop about the 8th Environmental Action Plan, which, if you don't know, a couple of years ago, the pursuit of a wellbeing economy was written into the European Environmental Action Plan. And there was a workshop on the progress of that this week. And in their closing remarks, DG Environment and DG Climate both mentioned that the elephant in the room or the underlying issue that they need to deal with is economic growth, is obsession with economic growth. So we're hearing that from within the EU institution, from within the Commission now as well. I think there's more transparency and honesty about how they're trying to tackle that. And of course, the conference, as Aileen said, was convened by a cross-party group of 20 MEPs, and they're coming together again in just a couple of weeks' time on the 7th and 8th of December to talk about what comes next. One of the strategic objectives we've come up with as civil society is that we want to push for a Beyond Growth intergroup at the European Parliament, and that's something that we'll be hopefully engaging some of those MEPs with and getting their support for when they come back together again on the 8th. And again, it's great of the alignment here. The next thing I was going to say is it's been mentioned a few times already about the need for the different layers of society to take responsibility and work together for economic system change. So yes, we need a strong and diverse civil society movement. We also need a shift in public discourse and public understanding to normalise beyond growth, and for people to be able to really articulate what a good life looks like for them in new ways. And to shift more explicitly onto policymakers, we need an increased number of policymakers acting as champions for wellbeing economy policymaking within their particular sphere of influence. And that's one of the other bits of my role in the global WEAll team, is supporting these policymakers who are interested, who are sort of self-identifying with this agenda and trying to make it happen. Along with Zoe Institute, we've got a closed sort of safe space policymakers network for anywhere in the world. These policy labs from EPC are another such safe space. It sounds like the OECD network is going to be another one. And indeed, that's really at the heart of what the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership is about, is peer learning in a safe space and trying to cultivate and encourage policymakers to be those champions. But when we think about overcoming the barriers to progress, which is the next part of what I've been asked to speak about, we do hear quite a lot from these policymakers about the barriers they're experiencing, about the things that make it difficult to be a champion, however much you might want to be. So I'll just quickly speak to a few of those before we open it up for questions. And the first thing that we hear all the time is the short-termism that is baked into government at every level, I think, at the moment. We've already heard from Wales, one of the best examples there is of an effective approach to move beyond this and using the legislative approach to move beyond short-termism. But there are other examples, including Japan, which Romina's mentioned, as well as what they're doing on budgeting. In Japan, they also work with futures design, and they've actually got groups of people who represent future generations acting as part of the decision-making processes within government, which is already starting to take their decision-making in different directions. But actually, in terms of making the case for moving beyond short-termism, Gary's already alluded to the concept of failure demand, which WEAll's done some research on, the costs basically of taking too short-term an approach with data from Scotland and Canada. And the idea of failure demand is just keeping making the same mistakes and stuck in a short-term loop. But we actually know we've got plenty of evidence that if we're preventative by design and build wellbeing into economic decision-making, we'll avoid harms and wasted costs. And being armed with that data is something that policymakers are finding really helpful. So that I'll share the link to that report in the chat in case that's useful. The second thing, perhaps related, is the perceived complexity of this agenda. And again, the safe learning spaces are really important for policymakers to be able to share openly and work with each other, because this is emergent. And there's no use me pretending that it's simple, as much as I would love to be able to do a sales pitch that implement the wellbeing economy. It's easy, here's how. Actually, you don't want system change to happen overnight. That would be horribly disruptive. It should take a long time. But there's no one size fits all either. And we've heard that really powerfully from Andrew about how Welsh the Welsh Act is. And so it should be, because it's really important that these approaches are contextual. However, on the bright side, when we're talking about complexity, and again, this is something else we've heard a few times today, what really matters to people and what a good life looks like and what we're aiming for is pretty simple most of the time, and it is pretty intuitive. And for policymakers, some of this is about unlocking their own instincts, and they'll quite often have an intuitive sense of what's right or wrong, or whether there's harm is going to be caused by a particular approach. So it's removing the barriers to that decision making and really empowering policymakers to act in the best interests of people. We've heard a lot about silos. I won't say too much more about silos, but I don't think we can list barriers without talking about them. And that's why at Europe level, we're really looking as a bunch of NGOs and think tanks at structural ways that the European institutions could evolve to help get out of the siloed mentality that does sort of permeate through the institutions. So in particularly in the short term, the idea of having a Beyond Growth intergroup with parliamentarians, we think is really important. In Scotland, we've got a cross-party group on wellbeing economy that has participation from MSPs from all the parties in the Parliament. And that's been really, really useful in helping the politicians to go on a learning journey, but also to collaborate and get out of silos and bring different departments together. So we would love to see that happen at European Parliament level as well from the new Parliament term next year. And we're, as I said, going to be looking for support from interested MEPs from the 8th of December. And longer term, we'll be advocating for the creation of permanent structures within the European Commission to assess beyond growth strategies and pathways. For example, I would dream of a new DG, a new Directorate General, or departments or units for wellbeing economy or for beyond growth to apply that scrutiny right across Parliament and right across the institutions. And Romina's shared so much about budgeting already, but it is important to mention the importance of central government processes like budgeting to help encourage policy coherence. And Ireland's an example that Romina mentioned and that we talk about a lot. Still a long way to go with Ireland, Italy. A lot of these, I don't think they would claim that they've got wellbeing budgeting exactly right, but it's also really important to celebrate and hold up as examples these countries that are genuinely trying to use the budget process to further support policy coherence for wellbeing. And above all of this, and the last point I'll make about barriers we need to overcome, sort of surrounding absolutely everything we've talked about today are the cultural and political norms of our society that we operate within. And that's not just the work of policymakers to change. We've all got a role to play in what norms are, in what common sense means. Policy can shift public mindsets shift policy. It's all cyclical. And I think despite all the horrors of the COVID pandemic, there are some bright spots and lessons from how we acted as a society and how some particular countries responded to the pandemic that should give us reason to be hopeful. For one thing, it was fairly intuitive and relatively quick for countries around the world to draw up a list of what key workers actually are. And what they're identifying there are the economic activities that are fundamental to our well-being as a society. And we've also got another report from WEAll that I'll share in the chat, done by fantastic researchers in New Zealand, Bhutan and Finland, who have demonstrated that those three countries, because of their well-being frameworks, actually made quick decisions when the pandemic hit that made for more economic resilience and actually better economic outcomes across every different way of looking at the economy, as well as better health outcomes and well-being outcomes, which they call the well-being reflex. So that's something else that actually the pandemic has sort of given us, this evidence that well-being frameworks, when they're already there and they were in place, that method of decision-making was better for everybody when emergency struck. And I think as a society, people are also questioning things that we took for granted to do with the economy, our relationship with work, our relationships with family, how we spend our time, what success means, what a good life looks like. Those questions were happening anyway, but it feels like they've been accelerated by all the changes that we experienced during and after the pandemic. And that's a good thing. I think the opening up of these conversations and these questions starts to create more space and willingness and appetite for conversations about economic system change. And all of this really demands participation. That's the last point I'll make before we move into the Q&A. WEAll is always going to champion a participatory approach to developing policy. Nothing about us without us. And a sort of final message for policymakers that are maybe daunted by the depth and the complexity of going through a participatory policy-making process. We often assume that public preferences are fixed and maybe see them as a barrier to whatever it is that a government wants to do or should be doing. But actually evidence from participatory processes shows that people's attitudes and behaviours change just by being part of that process, that the journey together really matters. It's not just about the end result that you get to. And here in the UK, the members of the Climate Assembly that happened in 2020, their views and behaviours changed during and after the process of being part of a citizens' assembly. It was a journey that they were on together, with the policymakers, and we've seen that through the work that WEAll's done at city level with local government on participatory processes as well. So hopefully, despite me just giving a list of barriers there, there's bits of hope and reasons to be cheerful in all of those as well. I'll hand back to you, Aileen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa, for that. I mean, I think it was a very rich, insightful contribution, and we really do appreciate that. And it's great, I think, to hear about, you know, all the different kind of initiatives that are happening at the European level and what WEAll is kind of trying to do, working together with the European Wellbeing Economy Coalition, which the European Policy Centre is also a part of as well. And I think as well, you know, the points that you made around, you know, the importance of having a beyond growth intergroup in the European Parliament, because our parliaments, you know, they really do have such an important leadership role, I think, to play in this in the wellbeing economy agenda. I mean, I know that so much is, you know, at the moment the focus has been around governments, but I think parliaments themselves, you know, as the, you know, elected representatives of our citizens, you know, have a clear role to play in kind of helping to kind of build that political support and consensus as well, and making sure that there is that kind of scrutiny and accountability of what our governments are doing and trying to advance this agenda. So thank you so much for your contribution. I'm very conscious of time. We have, I think, about 20 minutes for questions, and we have already one question in the chat, which is, I think, following on from Lisa's point about decolonising, and it was just to ask whether any of the OECD's members' wellbeing frameworks, whether they attempt to evaluate the relationship between the country in question and low incomes of non-OECD countries. So who would, I don't know if Romina would like to pick that question up first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for, I think, the very interesting question. To best of my knowledge, none of the national wellbeing frameworks that I was showing in that slide actually do, you know, encompass, I mean, an understanding of that relationship. What they do, so there are some, I would say, the very advanced ones, for instance, the New Zealand one, but also the Canadian one. They actually have another way to decolonizing, you know, the sort of the thinking and the measurement, the who counts and how we count, you know, what matters. And this is, they do that essentially by developing special frameworks on tools for native populations. So I think the Maori example, you know, within the New Zealand government is quite obviously telling in that respect. And there have been others actually that you know, proceed in a similar manner. In fact, not just in the OECD, but, you know, if you look at, for instance, the experiences of Latin American countries, some of which are not in the OECD, you tend to see that they really have this approach of really try to sort of to decolonize, in the sense that they want to be extremely inclusive, and they certainly have you know, that approach of ensuring that you know, it's not just sort of a small set of people that is sort of taking decisions on how they define societal progress. The other thing I wanted to say is that in the OECD, we are obviously very, very keen on also try sort of to respond to that criticism. I mean, and obviously, you know, we are traditionally, historically, you know, an organization, whose member countries, you know, where, you know, essentially coming from the richest sort of countries of the world, and, you know, North American, sort of very much driven. And so we have heard a lot of people telling us that some of the features of our framework, for instance, were too much Western oriented, and even some of our members, especially from the Asian economies, actually would not necessarily recognize themselves into that. So maybe this is not about decolonizing, but I think it's really sort of making sure that obviously the framework that we're using to compare and benchmark countries in the OECD is as universal as possible, that this is, you know, meaningful as possible for the countries that you know, that are in the OECD. And this is why now we are actually trying to expand and revisit part of our framework. And for instance, we're trying to sort of see whether it would be possible to give more emphasis to things such as harmony and balance, which are notions that actually speak a lot, you know, to the sense of well-being, especially in some Asian economies. And the final point, if I can still say a few words on this, I think the question is fascinating. And in a way, whether would it be legitimate for OECD countries to actually take final decisions on this idea of decolonization? I think it'd be great if obviously the OECD countries understand the importance of doing that. But on the other hand, the reality is that it would be so important that that conversation happens with the non-OECD countries. So it's where is the legitimacy of that? And by definition, OECD members are again only covering the very rich economy. So by definition, the decisions that are taken by OECD members sort of exclude, formally speaking, the ones that are not represented. Of course, there are some differences, especially when we're talking about the policies that are like the very international policies that have to do with development. So the aid and cooperation assistance, where of course the debate and sort of the governance is much more inclusive, and the global south is much more involved in those decisions. But I would say in a way, decolonizing is something that I'm not quite sure can happen within the OECD sort of mechanism, and actually now the UN is looking into it, and part of what I understand the new initiative at the UN Secretary General on measuring what matters and what counts, wants to do is exactly that, making sure that obviously the conversation happens with all actors, and certainly the non-OECD economies being those that need to be sitting at that table.
Thanks very much, Romina, for that. Is there anybody else on our panel that would like to pick up on that question?
Maybe just add a comment to what Romina said. So in a sense, within the Wellbeing Economy Government's group, we do policy labs to discuss topics. And this is why the topics we've discussed, in particular around Indigenous populations. If you look at thinking about a wellbeing economy as being inclusive, what are the outcomes across different populations, and how do you go about addressing that? And as Romina mentioned, the work in New Zealand is really good. There's probably across a number of policy domains different ways into that. When Romina was speaking, I was thinking of climate. We've got COP28 coming up, COP26 in Glasgow, COP27. I was thinking about the loss and damage fund that starts to think about how you pay money to the economies damaged by climate and the extreme weather events, and maybe that's something that the UN and other conversations will start to pick up.
No, thanks for that, Gary. I think that's that's right. I mean, I think in terms of what happened at COP26 around when I think the Scottish government was really pushing with the loss and damage, and obviously those causes still trying to I think reach agreement around the terms around the loss and damage fund, which obviously will form a part of the COP28. I don't know if Lisa or Andrew, if anybody want to pick up on anything, or
just a comment on in our legislation, we've got the seventh goal, which is a globally responsible Wales, which is, some of our stakeholders say, is sometimes the hardest goal, because you're trying to understand what decisions we make in Wales and how they impact outside of Wales, and understanding that, which is a really difficult challenge. But I know there's a lot of work on decolonisation in Welsh Government, but also on anti-racism in Welsh Government, and we've also been looking at the way in which we develop our future trends report, because actually it can be very easy for a certain group of people to imagine the future, and if those voices around imagine the future are not diverse, they don't reflect the past and the pull of the present and the pull of the past. So I think it's making sure that we have a responsibility as public officials to make sure that when we're doing these exercises, the wellbeing frameworks, the future exercises, that the voices of as many people as possible are reflected in that, and not to dominate. But it's a challenge I'm sure everyone has.
Thanks, Andrew, for that. Now we've got a couple of questions that have been coming in online, but I just want to open up to the floor if there are any questions from roving mic. I think there's a roving mic coming.
Very much. Can Lisa and Romina hear me? Can you? Yeah, you can hear me. Yeah. So it's another Scottish voice, Lisa, and we're dominating here today. So first of all, I will introduce myself, but I wanted to say first, thanks for the presentations. I found every single one of them very, very interesting, and I learned something from all of you. My name's Paul McAlevey. I work in the European Commission. I work in the department which is called the Joint Research Centre, which is effectively the in-house science department of the Commission. And Lisa, we don't yet have a DG for Wellbeing, but we do have an inter-service working group. So this March, the Joint Research Centre, which has a number of initiatives on metrics, dashboards, even modelling when it comes to wellbeing, we noticed that there was quite a bit of fragmentation across the services of the Commission, and we set up an inter-service working group on wellbeing and sustainable economy. Under the patronage also of the Vice President Šefčovič, who takes a big interest in this also, given his foresight and Green Deal responsibilities. So my question is really around fragmentation versus federation, or diversity versus uniformity. I think all of the presentations showed there's a really inspiring amount of stuff going on. Romina, you spoke about the huge variety of processes and methods. Lisa, you said system change cannot happen overnight. It's fine that there's all of these initiatives, and I think it's really, really motivating. And yet, maybe one of the, and I'll come to my specific question, maybe one of the problems or barriers you didn't mention, Lisa, was the obsession with GDP amongst decision makers. It's implicit in all of the discussion. So my question is diversity of approach enough? Or do we also need a sort of more uniform, federated approach where all of these actions somehow join hands to tackle this obsession that many decision makers have with GDP? So sorry for taking a bit of time, but it's a question really to all of you.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that if possible, Aileen. Sorry, I'm not sure if you were deciding in the room there.
All right, if I bring in Lisa, and then I'll come to Gary. Lisa, floor is yours, and then I'll pass it back over to Gary.
Okay, thank you, and brilliant input, Paul. Thank you. And I know there's a lot going on within the JRC, which is really encouraging in terms of institutional change. And to that point about the sort of balance between fragmentation and coherence, or sort of moving in one direction, we look to systems change theory and systems thinking for our own approach to this as the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. There's a really simple model called the 2 loops model, which I'd encourage you to look up, which is about system change, and it demonstrates how system change happens in nature and in society. And it's the idea that we start to have deviators from the current system. We've got a loop, and then certain actors start to go rogue and come up with new ideas and sort of push the boundaries and act outside of the system. And as there are more and more of those, a new system can only start to emerge where those actors are joined up. So I would really defend the importance of a diversity of approaches and of the importance of context, and not aiming for uniformity, but the focus on joining up and finding what is it that we do have in common, that we can all agree on, and move in that direction. But that doesn't mean that we have to agree on absolutely everything. This is the theory of change, essentially, that's informing our work with civil society actors. You've got quite a broad spectrum of civil society, NGOs, think tanks, activists, from the perspective of how radical they might be. If you think about the Overton window and how close they are to what the current norm is in terms of their sort of beliefs and where they sit, versus completely radically changing the system. But it's quite exciting that the Beyond Growth movement in Europe contains all of those, and we're all really working together, and we're identifying the shared idea that we have. So that vision that I shared at the beginning of my input on that shared vision for a wellbeing economy is something that a really diverse group of civil society actors has been able to get behind. So that's one of the ways that we're doing that dot joining, and that's not trying to change what these organisations or activists believe or get them to all conform with one single view. It's actually celebrating that we need, for system change, we need to be pushing right along the spectrum and in lots of different places. And I think you could apply the same to different elements of the European institutions and different parts of government, that we still have a need for different expertise, different ideas, different principles, but it's the connecting points in between the dots on the tulips model. And this is where I wish I had a slide of the tulips model, but I didn't know I would need it. So if you Google it, this might make more sense.
Thanks, Lisa. Gary.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think I agree with what Lisa's saying there in the kind of context of Paul's question. I think probably we will end up going back to some of Romina's work around countries with performance framework, because when systems are complex, countries will have come from different approaches, and ultimately it'll be outcomes that will determine whether we're making progress in that. So it will come back to data. It always starts with data, then you move beyond the data to policy and implementation. And the way I think about it is as a kind of complex system. We need actors across the system, and it doesn't, as long as they know what they're trying to achieve. So for us in Scotland, probably highlight the work around the just transition that we're trying to do, or fair work, or community wealth building. You've got some key kind of anchor policies, that's just economy space, which are trying to change that system. There's a risk on narrative that everything impacts on wellbeing, so you can paint a picture of it. Actually, we're all doing wellbeing economy. And again, that's just a risk that you have to take. And I think we're engaging with the business community in Scotland for what does it mean to be a business, a kind of responsible business in a wellbeing economy. And they may have a slightly different take. They might have that's okay, as long as they're aligned to where we want to get to. And I think definitions, you can go on about definitions. I thought Lisa's definition was really good, though some of the challenge we get is your definition's too long. So I actually preferred the WEAll one, social justice and a healthy planet. Actually, short, what does it mean? We talk about fair, green and growing economy, because I think we're not there yet in the discourse about degrowth fully, understanding that basically it's the direction of growth. We're hoping to develop a green transition for a lot of different industries, so it'll be different types of growth and opportunities, but it's the conditions of growth rather than the rate of growth. So all of that is complex. GDP is still there, Paul. We've developed a wellbeing economy monitor in Scotland which try to broaden the concept, but GDP does something in one indicator which people understand, and that's the challenge, but we'll need to try and address that.
Andrew.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've got two observations really. I think diversity of models is helpful because it helps you kind of understand what other people are doing. But I think there's a risk that I'm worried about sometimes on this agenda, because many of us have been involved in the sustainable development agenda for many years, and there's a whole system set up to kind of implement that. It's very similar, you know. There's a Venn diagram of these initiatives and these terms, and there's a danger of us, you know, going off into another conversation and going through the same journey that we've been on sustainable development, which has been on for about 30 years with the SDGs, the Earth Summit, with institutions set up to understand how to put that into practice. That's why when we've engaged on the wellbeing economy, because we think it's a helpful message, it's a helpful way to bring people in, it's a helpful way to explain it to a different audience. But at the heart of it, it's still a sustainable development approach, because sustainable development was about individuals, but also about for people and planet. So we've got to be very careful about these new terms. But from my perspective, if more people engage on this agenda through a wellbeing economy language, that's good, because it gets more people into the room. So we mustn't lose all of that intelligence, that insight, those networks. Avoid creating separate structures that go SD over here, wellbeing over here, because actually we will end up causing more problems and having to reconnect those things together. And I think there's something then about, you know, our experience in Wales. We've had some pushback around our approach to, not pushback, but we've had questions from other nations around why have you developed your own SDGs? And you know, it's a fair question, but what we have found is that our ability for the Welsh Parliament and the citizens of Wales to own the goals that are set is an important driver for the implementation of our approach, because the SDGs, whilst they're fantastic, they set a whole range of goals, 269 indicators, there's a whole system set up. We translated those into goals that meant something for the people of Wales and the Parliament of Wales. And so ownership of the vision gives you greater success of implementation. That's the theory. But when we asked stakeholders a couple of years ago, well, where does the SDGs fit into this? Their view was, we've done the exercise, we've worked out what it means for Wales. We now own our goals. We have a framework set up to do that. We believe that our goals are our contribution to the SDGs. We can be asked the question whether it is going far enough or going fast enough. But ownership of that is a really important driver for change. Otherwise, it becomes a top-down. We even get asked, it still feels like a top-down from a Welsh national perspective down to a local perspective, but it's a much more closer relationship than the SDGs. But again, that's not to, we are supportive of the SDGs and we'll make our contribution, but it's about understanding what will make these things work.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that. And I'm conscious that we only have about 5 minutes left. There are several questions that have come into the chat, so I'm going to try and roll them together, and if we can sort of keep our answers as succinct as we possibly can. So I think there's these are good questions, actually. There's a lot of questions. Yeah. So we have a question about whether if political cycles in Europe, if they are too short for this approach, does a longer term political cycle help with implementing this agenda? And I think there's also about, how the change towards a wellbeing economy for Europe also depends on what is understood to be, wellbeing. What do we actually mean by wellbeing? And do you think this should be an outcome of a European democratic process? And if yes, how can the EU encourage and facilitate establishing European political parties? So I know if perhaps Lisa might want to pick up on the last question, and just one other question which is directed at Gary, is saying, given your insights into economic advising for the Scottish Government, how do you envisage corporate governance and accountability evolving in the context of a wellbeing economy? And specifically, what changes would you recommend to ensure that businesses not only thrive economically, but also contribute positively to societal and environmental wellbeing in Scotland and beyond? So these are not straightforward questions, but nonetheless, say we can maybe sort of make some very kind of quick points in answers. So who would like to go first? Lisa?
I'll just give a brief response on the one about policy cycles, actually, because political cycles are roughly similar everywhere, not just in Europe. So this is something that all of us have to think about. And the legislative approach, as in Wales, is one way to sort of extend the cycle. The commissioners are appointed for 7 years, if I'm not wrong, Andrew, so stretching beyond the usual term of Parliament. But I think the other important thing I want to say here is about civil servants and the different mechanisms within government and the stuff that the public don't necessarily see being just as important or maybe even more important for this longevity of approach than the elected politicians. So here in Scotland, Gary and his team and plenty of others now within the Scottish Government, different civil service teams really working long term on things like the Wellbeing Economy Monitor that Gary mentioned. And we've had a change of First Minister recently. Our previous First Minister was a huge champion of this agenda. Our new First Minister picked up that mantle, but we'll have another change soon. But those mechanisms and frameworks and the people actually working within the machinery of government are outlasting the different ups and downs of politics, which I think is really important. So when we talk about politics, we need to not forget the civil servants.
Thanks, Lisa. And just very quickly.
Yeah, I'm going to try and answer this in a minute. But before that, just to say, we also have a Cabinet Secretary for Wellbeing Economy now in the Scottish Government. So that kind of reflects the change in the institutionalisation of it in terms of minister. In corporate governance, I think I'm involved with various business groups in Scotland. Loads of businesses recognise their wider role. Loads of businesses are involved in their local communities, look actively at providing wider kind of societal input. I think as part of this, there's also different alternative ownership models for businesses as well. But I think I would look at the report that was done in Scotland by the Scottish Council for Development Industry about the kind of purposeful businesses. And I think that's the change where we'll see much more purposeful businesses emerging. And that's certainly what we would like to say. So business need profit to survive, but they don't live to make profit. They live to have a wider impact, I think. So I'll stop there given the time.
Thanks very much, Gary. I don't know if Romina and Andrew, if there's any final remarks that you'd like to make before I draw this discussion to a close.
Yeah, just 10 seconds to say, I think we need unity on the narrative and a diversity of coherent tools, because policymakers have different needs and they need, they're working with different solutions, but those solutions and tools need to be all designed, with the same purpose. And this is what the narrative is giving us.
I just want to pick up on Lisa's comment about the role of the civil service. I know the OECD have done some interesting work around the capabilities of the civil service across OECD nations and their ability to understand the challenges that governments face, and that gives that continuity. So I think it's a recognition that a lot of our policies need people to implement, and some of those people exist in the civil service as well as in other nations. So it's more about understanding the role of people can play in delivering policy.
Thanks very much for that, Andrew. And I think all that remains, for me to say is a big thank you to all of our panelists and for your presentations. I think this has been a really super interesting and very inspiring discussion this afternoon. And I'm really grateful for your time and, really my sincere thanks to you all for sharing with us, such rich and insightful perspectives, and for helping the APC to launch its Wellbeing Economy Policy Lab this afternoon. This is exactly the kind of discussion that we were hoping and looking to be able to obtain today, and also for us going forward. It has been really, really appreciated. And lastly, my thanks to our audience for joining us today, and for also those who've been joining us online, for all your comments and questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aileen.
Thank you.